Thank you for coming, and much has been said of bias, and in a town that's full of politics and opinion, it's kind of hard to be anybody without bias, but I do appreciate that you and your team try to avoid having bias in your reporting and try to be as objective as possible. I appreciate that. And I think you and other inspectors general do a great service to our country trying to figure out and make things better and root out where there are problems. I would say that when we look at bias, I guess the first question would be a short question, just to reiterate and make sure it's very clear. You did find evidence of biased individuals who were involved with the investigation.
That's correct.
Okay, and I think that's very clear. And is it difficult to determine what people's motives are, or whether they're biased or not biased?
It's very difficult.
Right. And so just by saying you didn't find it doesn't mean it didn't exist. It doesn't mean you couldn't have had 15 people very biased who influenced every one of their decisions. You just can't prove it.
We could not prove it. We lay out here what we can prove.
Okay. One specific instance I'd like to ask you about, though. The OGC attorney is the one I think you've referred for criminal evaluation, correct?
I'll just say we've referred to the Attorney General and the FBI Director.
Right, for possible, and that's the possible criminal evaluation. He also had text messages that said, Viva la resistance. Did you interpret those to be, or what would your opinion, does that show that he might have had some bias against the Trump administration?
Well, he was one of the individuals in last year's report precisely for those text messages that we referred to the FBI precisely for that concern.
But you interpreted that as an evidence of bias. But I guess my question would be, if you saw that he was biased, he's obviously made errors that you think actually may have been intentional. Why in that instance would you not be free to say that there's documentary evidence of not only bias but then malfeasance?
That's precisely why we don't say that as to the errors, the failures in the FISA process.
Right, but could you then specifically say the opposite, that actually in this instance there actually was evidence of political bias and evidence of record changing that looks like malfeasance?
There is evidence of both. I agree with you, but we will I want to make sure there's a fair process.
That's fine, and I think the chairman's very correct that the media has misinterpreted what you've said and drawn conclusions that I don't think are accurate as to what you're saying, and people should read the report, and the report is very damning as to the process, whether there's bias or not, there are problems. Now, getting to your solutions, you've suggested that, and I think you're attempting to make valid suggestions as to how the process would be better. I would make the argument that the process cannot be corrected. And the reason I would say this is that the FISA court system requires this high scrupulous nature for the agents, and they are both the prosecutors and supposed to be defense at the same time. There isn't anybody on the other side. And this is not the standard of the Constitution, and we've allowed this to happen because we're going after foreigners, and we just frankly said, well, we're not going to have all the constitutional protections for listening to Gaddafi's phone calls or Saddam Hussein. We're just not going to have all these protections. My point is, we're now getting into something that's at the root of our democracy or of our republic, and that is political debate and discourse in the First Amendment. I don't think the tweaks to the FBI will work. I frankly think what we have to understand is the FISA court's for foreigners. It's at a lower than constitutional level. And so I guess my question to you would be, do you think it's within the realm of the reforms that we should consider is whether or not political campaigns should be investigated using a secret court where there is no legal representation for the defense?
And you raise excellent questions here, and one of the things that we are careful not to do is when we make recommendations is make recommendations to Congress on statutory changes. So we try and work with the process, as you noted. There will be a lot of debate that goes well beyond what we're recommending to try and fix what's existing. There's going to be a legislative look. The FISA court clearly is going to look at some of these issues now. And I do think, and we're prepared to come meet with legislators and talk through these issues as you all consider things that go beyond the four corners of what exists. I think one of the issues here, and we reference this, having been a prosecutor where you go ex parte to a court for search warrants and wiretaps in the criminal process, but you also know that at some point the defense lawyer is going to get those if there's a case made, and there's the potential for a litigation in an open courtroom before a judge with a defense lawyer cross-examining. And that alone, that understanding that that could happen,
Right.
has some effect.
Yeah, and I agree. And I think if you don't have that in the FISA system, no matter what you do, you tweak the system. When you're telling me it requires FBI agents to always be scrupulous and never have bias enter into that, we're trying to prevent bias from entering in. I just don't, I think it's a standard that's too high for individuals to take. And there will always be people on both sides of the political spectrum who may let their biases enter into that. And the check is to have a defense attorney, to have a public trial. And secret courts really were not intended to examine crime in America or to examine political campaigns. And I think that's the thing that needs to come out of this, is that we don't, and this is why I don't fault your recommendations for FBI process to make it better. There's a big danger that we take that politically and say, oh, that's the end answer to that. No, the lesson to me on this is that, and I do believe both sides could be equally culpable of this, is that we should not subject our political campaigns to secret courts and to secret warrants and secret surveillance. And there are all these questions still of, were all these encounters that Papadopoulos had just accidental? Did the government instigate these encounters? And if they did, that's very, very troublesome to me, that our own government would be sending informants into campaigns to try to have chance encounters with different people. So I'm very, very worried about it, and I hope other members of the committee will consider, as we look at FISA reform, that what we have to do is Americans shouldn't be caught up in this. American citizens were not the target of this, and even American citizens who talk to foreigners. Can you imagine in campaigns moving forward that if you're pointed to a high-level foreign policy position, is there a likelihood that you may have talked to Russians or Chinese in your career? If you've been in a foreign policy career for 40 years, you've talked to many Russians. And so to say you're an agent, well, he had 16 conversations with different members of the Russian government. Is that enough to open like a FISA process into that he might be a foreign agent? And it's not the Constitution. It's showing that you have evidence that someone may be related to a government. It isn't evidence of a crime. And so I think we ought to really consider as we move forward that this is not the appropriate vehicle for investigating political campaigns. Thank you.
And if I could just add on that, Senator, I think one of the things also here that we uncovered and learned as we did this, for example, you mentioned the confidential human source issue, separate from the FISA. The absence of rules there applies whether this was counterintelligence or criminal. There did not need to be notice to the department, even if had this been criminal investigation. So I think there are some issues here that cover broader than just the FISA issue that you've raised and concerned about.